It's very good to see you on this Easter Monday.
Our Easter is Sunday.
I'm so sorry. Okay. My first mistake of the morning. Welcome to this policy letter press conference. The materials that you have are embargoed for right now, for 10:30. We are live, we are on the record. To my immediate right is Mr. Charles Dallara, the Managing Director of the IIF. To his right, Mr. Hong Tran, who is Deputy Managing Director and runs the IIF's capital markets and policy work. And to his immediate right is the IIF Deputy Managing Director and Chief Economist, Philip Suttle. We have a number of distinguished colleagues also in the room. Jeffrey Addis, the European Director, is over there, and any difficult questions we'll pass to Jeff. So we have two documents for you. We have a policy letter, which you know is always produced in advance of the spring meetings, but we also have a product that's really quite recent and which will be discussed in a few minutes by Phil Suttle, which is the Emerging Markets Bank Lending Conditions Survey. And Mr. Suttle will explain that to you, what's its content and its purpose in a few minutes. But let me start by asking Mr. Dallara to introduce the policy letter to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, and thank all of you for joining us on this Monday morning here in Washington. I think we all know that the world economy is still searching for a new rhythm in global economic growth. Signs are mildly encouraging in the U.S. economic outlook, and a number of emerging markets continue to demonstrate robust growth. However, we focused our policy letter today on the challenges ahead for Europe, not only because it's crucial for the future of the European economy, but also because it's obviously crucial for the global economy. You might have noticed, for example, that in recent months, trade flows to Europe have declined notably. Just in the first 2 months of this year, exports by China to Europe, for example, actually fell on a year-over-year basis slightly. This reflects, obviously, the substantial impact which the recession in Europe is having on trade in China, but it's being seen elsewhere. U.S. exports to China have declined substantially over recent months, as have exports from other key economies. Now, it's not to suggest that the challenges facing other key economies in the world are unimportant, and we stressed in our policy letter that we sent ahead of the G20 ministerial meeting some weeks ago. The continued importance of focusing on a global process of policy coordination, which helps frame a more effective medium-term set of policies for key countries such as the United States, China, India, Brazil, Japan, as well as Europe. And I would, in that connection, continue to reiterate the crucial importance of a credible medium-term fiscal adjustment plan for a number of mature economies, in particular the United States, where the markets may well be giving the U.S. time to get through the elections here, but it's less clear at all that markets will give a new president or a re-elected President Obama much time to frame a credible set of medium-term fiscal policies. Coming back to Europe, we recognize the important steps that have been taken in Europe in recent months to stabilize the sovereign debt situation, which really threatened some months ago to pull the entire world economy back into another severe recession. Those steps include, of course, the overwhelming success of the voluntary debt exchange and new program for Greece, which is now coming together. Secondly, the exceptional support of the ECB to address liquidity strains in the Eurozone. Thirdly, the continued efforts by individual governments, especially I would say those that currently have programs such as Portugal and Ireland, but also Spain and Italy, to find a way forward that both addresses the need for fiscal adjustment, but also moves quite impressively on structural reforms. And as I think we've seen in the case of Greece, and we see to lesser extents, but nevertheless importantly, in other cases, that without structural reforms, growth is unlikely to rebound on any sustained basis in some of these key economies of Europe. And therefore, it is particularly important and encouraging, quite frankly, to see that countries like Spain and Italy, following earlier measures taken in Ireland and Portugal, have now launched what I consider to be quite impressive labor market reform plans. And while they may not produce immediate dividends, it's I think, crucial that they follow such programs through vigorously in order to enhance growth potential over the medium term. Other measures have been taken to address the European sovereign debt situation, including, of course, the measures to strengthen Europe's firewall, which, if you look back over the past year, have been quite meaningful. And yet, as we sit here today, this letter brings to our attention a number of additional measures which are needed to put Europe on a steadier course toward renewed growth. And I'll just mention them very briefly, and my colleagues can amplify, or we can return to them at a later point. First, we would say a more balanced approach toward fiscal adjustment. Too much short-term austerity is unlikely to produce the economic results one needs, either on the fiscal front or on the growth front. And while we fully appreciate the need for steady and convincing progress toward medium-term fiscal sustainability in many countries throughout Europe, we would caution about too much emphasis on short-term austerity and would encourage countries which are pursuing their reform policies and the countries of Northern Europe, which are crucial for the overall strategy, especially Germany and France, to work with their fellow Eurozone members to find the right balance here, bringing to the fore, once again, the kinds of structural adjustment measures which we've talked about. You may have recently seen a very successful privatization in Portugal, for example, of the energy company. Greece has a very ambitious and I think now realistic privatization program ahead of it. These measures, along with labor market reforms and other measures to liberalize economic structures, are crucial to job creation, and at the same time, it's very important to avoid vicious negative cycles of budget cutting and economic contraction. And right now, of course, we see Portugal, Spain, Greece all in different degrees of economic contraction this year. And indeed, the entire Eurozone is in a mild state of economic recession. Secondly, we would stress, as Europe moves forward, the need to develop broader and more ambitious medium-term fiscal plans for mutualization of fiscal policies, and eventually a much more integrated approach for fiscal management in the Eurozone. This was part of the original vision when the euro was conceived. It has not materialized, but it needs to. And obviously these are difficult issues for Europe to grapple with, but that does not deny at all the necessity of finding ways forward here. And at the same time, we would encourage Europe to develop the institutional apparatus necessary to facilitate further progress on integrating the Eurozone financial sector, developing Euro-wide approaches toward resolution, and other measures which can offset the fragmentation which we see growing in Europe and the global economy more generally. You know, we take for granted the benefits of globalization. I think we all know that this brings real challenges with it, but I think we also recognize that the globalization that has taken place over the last few decades has been key to the economic prosperity which has been realized in virtually every corner of the world to varying degrees. What we've seen over the last few years since the global financial crisis has actually been a move away from globalization, and we see it especially in the financial arena where there are growing signs of fragmentation. This is particularly evident in Europe, although it's not exclusively a European problem, and we would encourage European leaders to renew their commitment to EU-wide financial and economic integration in order that the gains will not be lost, and in order to avoid rebuilding inefficiencies in nationalistic, fragmented financial systems, which will inevitably weigh on growth. At the same time, it's important to continue the search for finding the right balance in regulatory reform. We have long recognized that the capital and liquidity requirements which prevailed ahead of the financial crisis a few years ago proved to be inadequate and need significant strengthening. And we're very supportive of the overall approach taken by the Basel Committee and the Financial Stability Board in this regard. However, we've seen tendency to accelerate regulatory reform beyond the timetable agreed in the fall of 2010. We've seen a tendency for individual countries to gold plate regulatory reform requirements, and we've seen a tendency in recent months for the European Banking Authority legitimately searching to find this right balance between assuring investors that leading financial institutions in Europe are adequately capitalized, and at the same time trying to deal with the sovereign debt problem. But unfortunately, in our view, that balance has not yet been found, and the overall effects has been really to produce another round of rather severe deleveraging in Europe in particular, although it's a global phenomenon once again. And this has led to continued credit contraction in many parts of Europe, quite severe in some countries, and has significantly inhibited the recovery which we have been searching for. And therefore, we would encourage European regulatory and supervisory and finance authorities to take another hard look at the need to find the right balance, to put on hold any tendencies to impose further capital burdens, to modify sooner rather than later the originally proposed liquidity requirements under Basel III, which, according to many, and not just in the private sector, but many in the public sector, have considerable need of reform if we're to avoid continued unnecessary deleveraging. Finally, the European arena needs to take steps, in our view, the Eurozone authorities, to further strengthen the firewall. And here my colleague Hung Tran can add, but I think we were somewhat disappointed by the recent decisions coming out of meetings of Eurozone leaders that missed an opportunity, in our view, to bolster further the scale of the resources which are mobilized in support of program countries in Europe. Finally, we have drawn your attention in the policy letter to the need for us all to take stock of the lessons learned coming out of the Greek and more generally the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. Some of these may be particular to Greece, some of these are likely to be broader issues. We've flagged a few of them here, but there are many others. Weaknesses in crisis prevention. How do we get to the point where Greece's debt built to an remarkably unsustainable level. How did Greece get to the point where their policy, where their economic structure became so woefully inefficient? How did creditors manage to fail to recognize the growing risk of pouring money into Greece? These are questions which we all should reflect upon, with a willingness of all parties to be brutally self-critical as necessary. Subordination of private investor claims. It worries us that the ECB struck a deal with Greek authorities and Eurozone authorities at the last minute, not just because of the particularities of Greece. And let me assure you that we never expected the ECB to follow PSI terms. But I think it raises some important issues here regarding subordination that have precedential implications which we need to reflect upon. Thirdly, I think the Greek debt restructuring has demonstrated the importance of collective action clauses being embedded in sovereign debt around the world, and not just internationally issued debt, but in domestic debt as well. And of course it raises the issue of the retroactive application of collective action clauses, which I think we should acknowledge is an unfortunate dimension of the Greek deal. Finally, we mentioned here the need to strengthen what was a remarkably opaque and at times obscure process of setting the macroeconomic targets and debt sustainability assumptions in the Greek program. I don't wish to be misunderstood. We consider that on the whole, the successful conclusion of the voluntary debt exchange, with now something close to 97% of the holdings in private hands having been submitted to or committed to or cleared already through the exchange, is quite a stunning event. And a testimony, in my view, to the strong leadership of the Greek government, persevering through exceptionally difficult circumstances. A testimony as well, I think, to the willingness at the end of the day, in spite of doubts in certain quarters, for Eurozone leaders, with the support of the IMF, to step up and make substantial additional commitments. And a testimony to private investors being willing to look beyond the short-term pain on their balance sheet to the longer-term interest of European and global economic stability, all of which are very positive dimensions of the Greek story that has unfolded over these past few months. But I think it's important, again, that we take stock of what we've just gone through and we learn lessons that we can apply to make the system operate better in the future. Let me stop now and ask my colleague to add a few points.
Thank you, Charles. I just have two quick points to add so that we can move on quickly. One is that as the result of the lessons of the Greek voluntary debt exchange that Charles summarized, we are pleased to announce that we are launching senior level public-private sector joint committee under the auspice of the chairman of the group of trustees to compose of leaders both in the public and private finance to look at the lessons that we have got in the past 6-7 months going through the Greek debt negotiation to learn what are the issues, what are the lessons, what are the practices that need to be enhanced going forward, both for crisis prevention and for crisis resolution as well. So I think that is important to strengthen the international framework for sovereign debt financing. Second point I want to draw your attention is that complement to the more balanced fiscal policy approach that Charles explained, and also as part of the need for the regulatory authorities in Europe and elsewhere to refrain from adding more requirements and more burdens on banks, is really the need for the euro area in particular to fix the broken monetary transmission mechanism, because such transmission mechanism has been severely impaired. We see that when the ECB added significant amount of liquidity to the banking system, altogether more than €1 trillion through 2 long-term refinancing operations, loan to the private sector in the euro area continue to decline in the latest period to 0.7% year over year, declining from more than 2.6% a year ago, which is very weak performance compared to the situation in the US and elsewhere. So it is very important that given the recessionary tendency in the euro area, restoring the sound banking system and effective monetary transmission mechanism is key. Thank you.
Phil, please.
Thanks a lot. I'm just going to slightly change the subject somewhat, although the survey that you have in front of you echoes many of the themes that Charles and Hung just mentioned. As Charles mentioned, we're launching this morning our, I think it's our 10th or 11th version of our emerging market bank lending survey. It's a very comprehensive survey of lending conditions in emerging market regions. In fact, it's a unique survey. There's no one else that provides this degree of information. And we've been quite pleased with the traction that this survey is actually getting, both amongst our members and also from the official sector. I think I'd highlight four key aspects of the survey this morning. The first and perhaps most important is that after a very precipitous drop in our overall index last quarter, it's come back a little bit this quarter, the aggregate reading, which you can sort of interpret a bit like a purchasing managers index, is an improvement from 44.7 last quarter to 48.6. What that's telling you is in the emerging world, bank lending conditions are still tightening somewhat, but not as badly as they were 3 months ago. The reason for that is simple. It's the benefit, or at least we think it's simple, it's the benefit of the ECB's actions to, and other central banks as well, it must be said, but especially the ECB, to ease funding conditions in international markets. And one of the very important ways the euro crisis was spilling into the international arena and hurting other economies was through this dislocation in international funding conditions in cross-border banking markets, and that situation seems to have improved somewhat. We haven't come back to where we were 6 months ago, but at least the bleeding has somewhat stopped. The second feature of the survey, which is somewhat less encouraging, is that the demand for credit in the emerging world, not the supply, but the demand for credit in the emerging world seems to be slipping somewhat. And I think this is a reflection of what's happening within many emerging economies. They've tightened policy, they've tried to restrain credit-led expansions, and you can say those policies are beginning to have some effect. But we've been conducting this survey for about 2.5 years now, and this is the first reading where the demand for credit's actually gone down. The third component, or the third feature of the survey that I think is worth highlighting is that the environment for trade finance is actually still quite positive. So I think this is a nice sign from the survey, a positive sign from the survey, and I think suggests that what you've got happening here in international banking markets is a lot of dislocation from Europe, but there's enough sort of inherent strength out there, especially, for example, in Asia, with banks willing to provide trade finance for us to make up for some of those problems. And then the fourth feature of the survey, which I think is quite interesting, is that when you look at banks in Asia, and we have around 25 to 30 banks in Asia responding to our survey, so we feel this is a pretty good sample. When you look at banks in Asia, they're actually tightening credit conditions on a fairly sustained basis. We actually view this as a very positive development, because we think this is a good sign that Asian banks, operating in a very difficult global environment, have actually learned some of the lessons from the past, and with very strong domestic credit expansion being a potential problem in the future, the fact that they're taking things today a little more cautiously and a little more conservatively, I think suggests that maybe future problems in Asia may be smaller than they might otherwise be. But there's a lot more detail in the survey. It's around 20, 30 pages long, I believe. It's a pretty comprehensive data set, and I'm sure you'll find other interesting features in it, but those are the main ones that I'd like to highlight. Right?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we're going to see if we've got one or two journalists on the phone, just in case.
Hi, is there anybody on the phone?
Doesn't seem to be. Okay, let's take questions from here. Please just introduce yourself when you ask a question. Let's start here and over there, and then we'll come back to the front. So please go ahead. And we'll get a microphone to you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Christoph Eisenring, Neue Zürcher Zeitung from Switzerland. I have one question about the lessons you draw from Greece. You didn't talk about introducing a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. Perhaps you could, the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. If that could be something we should go for, the proposition which was made a couple of years ago by Anne Kruger from the IMF. A second question, we are before the IMF spring meeting, and at the spring meeting they will debate about increasing the resources of the IMF. Now you said that Europe didn't quite do enough for increasing the funds. Should the IMF go ahead, even though the amount is not yet what you would like to see, or not? Thank you.
Well, first, we didn't talk about the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism because we think today, as we did some years ago, that it's a bad idea. Nothing from the Greek experience remotely suggests that this would have worked better with the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. First of all, it doesn't deal with crisis prevention at all, and it makes it very difficult. The proposal as originally structured would have made it very difficult for private investors to have any confidence that their concerns would have been adequately heard. And one real benefit of the way the negotiations played out in Greece, in spite of the huge losses which investors agreed to undergo, was that they were responsible for those decisions, not some Supreme Court set up in the towers of the IMF. And for those of you who are not familiar with the SDRM, what it basically would have done is to convey a great deal of supranational authority to some new body attached to the IMF that would have had adjudication authority over sovereign debt restructurings. In the end of the day, why did so many investors decide to put their claims into the debt exchange? A large part of it was that they felt they had a voice every step of the way. And Jean Lemire and I, with whom I closely work, along with whom Vikas Hajimichael and a number of others, made sure that all investors in our steering committee and in our larger investor committee felt consulted, informed, and in the end, the decision to support the final structure of the deal was their decision. And I think this should not be underestimated in terms of the benefit to the system, because when restructurings in sovereign arena have to take place, it's very important that neither the creditor nor the debtor feel disenfranchised. And I think in this case, ultimately, neither was. They both had hugely critical voices, notwithstanding the complexity of this one because of the Eurozone arena. I think that answers the bulk of your first question, doesn't it?
The second question was on IMF resources.
Well, let me just say a brief word, and then I'll ask Hung to add a word on both issues. Maybe you can say a word in the first connection about the principles for sustainable capital flows. The case for strengthening IMF resources is quite strong in our view, and not just dependent upon Europe. I think the strains in the Eurozone, which have brought European economies back, core European economies back to the IMF for the first time in over 3 decades, since Italy and the UK borrowed from the IMF in the late 70s. I think those strains do add to the case for a strengthening, a substantial strengthening of IMF resources. But certainly a more, I think, more forward-leaning approach by Europe itself might well help catalyze that process and give further energy and momentum to it. No?
Yeah, thank you, Charles. Very quickly about the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, we think that the alternative that the marketplace has more or less embraced since 2004 based on the market practices and the guidelines of the principle on stable capital flow and fair debt restructuring is a superior model and superior framework for debt resolution. At the same time, but we concluded the Greek debt negotiation, we have another much smaller, but nevertheless also very significant sovereign debt exchange, that of St. Kitts and Nevis, also involving complete voluntary negotiation between private sector creditors and the sovereign debtor. In the case of St. Kitts and Nevis, resulting in 97% voluntary participation in the debt exchange. So it showed that a market-based, voluntary, good faith negotiating effort provide for a fairly robust framework to resolve debt crisis. And if we supplement it and enhance it with the crisis prevention features and with the lessons that we have learned through the Greek experience, we are very confident that that model will serve the international financial community very well going forward to deal with both sovereign debt, crisis prevention and resolution. And certain point about the resources, just to give some figure to the issue that we highlight in the policy letter, we were a bit disappointed when the Eurogroup finance minister meeting in Copenhagen announced that they would keep the new fresh lending capacity of the firewall to 500 billion euro. The 300 already committed to the 3 program countries. So the overall size of resources that have been mobilized at this point is about 800 billion euro. We had hoped that the leaders would be able in a position to accept and agree one of the proposals put forth by the European Commission, simply to combine the 2 facilities, the EFSF at 440 billion and the new ESM at 500, so that the 2 would have the overall capacity of 940 billion euro. We would think that that would be a nice first step in this effort to put forth a very credible firewall. It is important in the sense that based on feedback from many major emerging market countries, a sizable resources committed by the European leaders would be catalytical in the view of many emerging market countries in unlocking their own contribution to the increase of resources for the IMF for global crisis, including that of Europe.
Yeah, let's go over there to Ian, and I think you had one too, but you've both got microphones already, so what can we do? Ian, go ahead.
Ian Taylor, Dow Jones. Thanks for doing this. Just to follow up on the resource question, just looking at financing costs, say, over the next several years for peripheral countries that are in trouble in Europe. What's your estimation of the actual amount that the IMF and Eurozone should put together? And then secondly, you note a number of issues your new committee should discuss in terms of preventing and resolving debt crises. Is this, should we read this in any way as a preemptive and urgent action ahead of potential future other European debt restructurings?
Let me address the second one, and then I'll ask Holmes to address the quantity issue. Absolutely not. This is not intended to be either urgent or preemptive. It needs to be a bit reflective, actually. I think that what has descended upon the world over the last few years is a growing awareness that many advanced, mature economies have stretched their fiscal and debt positions beyond the bounds of what markets are now comfortable with. Now, you could argue that markets should have recognized this earlier on, and one of the issues that we intend to address is is just how crisis prevention can be strengthened in terms of risk management by the firms themselves. But this is not just Euro-specific. And right now we see no country in Europe which needs anything remotely similar to what Greece just experienced. That is a massive voluntary debt restructuring. Portugal is on track with its economic program. Spain, Italy, as is Ireland, Spain and Italy are moving forward quite impressively. We do call for some reorientation of those programs, as you may have noted. But we don't anticipate the need to put these rules to work for any of these countries. More generally, what we're looking for is just, as we were in 2004 when these principles for sustainable capital flows were developed, we're looking to strengthen the fabric of the system and the framework within which debt restructurings, wherever they may be, can go forward.
On the first question, our thinking is a bit slightly different from the way you pose the questions. Our thinking started first the right policy approach to really solve the fundamental challenges put forth by the crisis. And as we explained, the fundamental policy approach needs to have a more balanced fiscal policy, needs to have a step to strengthen the banking system and the monetary transmission mechanism in the euro area, and so on and so forth. That is very important. Second, eventual mutualization of the fiscal problem and fiscal burdens in the euro area, in our view, at the end of the day, is the key lasting solution to the problem. In other words, when you want to have a monetary union, a common currency, then you should be prepared to move toward a mutualization of your fiscal responsibilities, resources, and burdens. So that is the direction that we would urge the leaders in Europe to move. In the context of that, a combination of the EFSF and ESM to 940 billion would be a nice first step in our view. Basically, the key issue there is clarity, to the extent that the three program countries, Greece, Portugal, and Ireland, should be very clear to everyone that to the extent that they keep their program on track, they keep doing the right thing by implementing in time and in full the reform and the consolidation step that contained in the program, then they should be assured of official financing support. And that will take a huge amount of uncertainty, particularly in countries like Portugal at this time. Market participants are worried about what happened in the next 12 months. Will they have assured financing to cope with the very big redemption of debt September 2013? So some indication that if the countries are doing their homework correctly, they should be assured of official support. I think that will be very important to remove uncertainty. Of course, the consequence of that commitment, which has been written in several of the Eurogroup declaration and statement, is that the leaders should be prepared to mobilize whatever resources needed to make good that commitment.
Why don't you've got the mic over there, and I called you earlier, so why don't you go ahead, please.
Hugo Leray with Agence France-Presse. In the coming weeks, you will have elections in G7 and Eurozone country, which is France. And the leading candidate in the polls is a socialist who said that finance is an adversary to the values of the Republic, to equality and so on. And there's also other countries in Europe where the public is more and more disgruntled against finance. Do you have any comments on that? What could you reply to this candidate?
Well, I would not for a moment advise any particular candidate, whether a French candidate or another nationality. What I would say is that it's crucial the political leaders across the board, including in this country, recognize that finance has to be the partner of governments if you're going to have a lasting recovery. It was all well and good for a period of time, I think, to throw heavy criticism, some of which was undoubtedly deserved, at the financial community after the crisis erupted in 2007, 2008. We've gone well beyond that point of productivity in populist rhetoric about financial institutions. We need credit, and we need healthy financial institutions. Certainly, regulatory reform is an important part of that, but as I pointed out earlier, one cannot help but be concerned about the deleveraging, especially in Europe today. Partly as a result, in my view, of the regulatory pendulum having gone too far, and this is exacerbated, in my view, by exceptional proposals for taxes on financial institutions, which in the end penalize the consumers and the corporates, which are struggling. You don't have to look very far to go on any website of any news media in Europe or any printed press to find articles about credit crunch impacting real firms, real people, the real economy. That's what this should be about, not about rhetoric against financial institutions.
Let's go to the back there, and then we'll go right across the front row, because everybody here wants a question, so we'll have to do that. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Robin Harding from the Financial Times. Charles, you talked about fragmentation in Europe over the last few years in the wake of the financial crisis. Could you elaborate a bit more on what you meant by that? What sort of fragmentation? Who is causing this fragmentation? You could argue that actually the response to the financial crisis has been remarkably global, and there's been remarkable coordination in things like the Greek bailout. If you could just elaborate on what you meant by that remark.
Well, I certainly don't see, perhaps, Robin, it's a different prism that we're using, but I don't see the Greek bailout as being directly related to the concerns we're addressing here. There was indeed, although I wouldn't use the term bailout because I don't think there's any Greek citizen that feels bailed out, nor should they. And I really think it is an extraordinarily misleading term. The next time you're tempted to type it in, think about what a bailout conveys. It conveys protecting someone from the consequences of their decisions. Isn't that the notion of a bailout? I don't know any Greek corporate or Greek citizen that has been protected. But let me go back to the point at hand. I think that fragmentation is gradually gaining momentum and undermining globalized approaches here. You look at the Basel Accord, it's a good example. It was reached in the fall of 2010. New rules of the game on capital and liquidity, right? You all read about them, we followed them. In the intervening year and a half, how many countries, how many authorities, how many jurisdictions have decided to deviate from that accord for their own particular reasons? Now each country, whether it's the UK with the Volcker proposal, or whether it's the US with the Volcker proposal, or the UK with its own particular proposals, may feel that it has a national imperative to do so. But the result is that you begin to have highly differentiated rules of the game for crucial, important dimensions of how firms operate and how they are capitalized, how their liquidity is managed, how they are resolved. And the result, inevitably, will be and already is becoming less and less mobility of capital and liquidity across borders. Therefore, the build-up of what will be seen, I am convinced, eventually as much more fragmented, nationally structured financial institutions, going back to a world that looks much more like the banking world of the 60s and the 70s in terms of national structures than the globalized financial structures that we've come to know. Now, certainly, we know that those globalized financial structures have serious weaknesses. And that's why the world developed the Basel Committee, the Financial Stability Board, to frame global solutions. But I would ask the policymakers why frame global approaches if they didn't deviate from them. You see any number of other capitals in Europe saying we're going to accelerate the Basel timetable. Well, what is the justification for that? There may be national circumstances which dictate in that direction, but I would argue that sacrificing global consistency is generating a huge cost for the world economy, because it will simply and clearly and profoundly lead to a much more efficient use of capital around the world, and therefore to less job creation.
If I may, Judge, just to give some concrete incidences of fragmentation, particularly in the context of Europe, you have seen in recent months clear national fragmentation in the sovereign debt market, in the bank lending market, and in bank funding market. In the sovereign debt market, you have more and more domestic banks and other financial institutions buying up their own sovereign bonds, but not other foreign sovereign bonds in the euro area. The cross-border flow has declined, but the domestic acquisition of government bonds, particularly in Italy and Spain, has increased significantly in the past 2 quarters. Bank lending is more being done nationally, particularly in the context of the Central and Eastern European countries. Regulatory requirement by Austria and other countries require that any new lending there has to be funded largely by domestic funding sources, not by cross-border financing. And last but not least, funding markets, you see more and more both deposits and long-term funding for banks more or less go into their own national banks and not cross-border banks. So I think that these are symptoms of both the interaction between the sovereign debt crisis and some of the regulatory and prudential reaction to that crisis, which in some cases going a bit overboard, producing unintended consequences.
Good, let's go to the front. Yes, please. Yes, no, go ahead, please. Yes,
me?
Yes, sure.
I have 2 questions. My name is Désspοινα Συριοπούλου from Greek American News Agency. I would like to ask you first, are you worrying that the upcoming elections in Greece will put at risk the new ambitious program and a non-technocratic prime minister will take over? And the second one is, you've been working a long time with Europeans regarding the Greek case. We saw many back and forths. How functional is would you describe the European team, or how much organized?
Great. Yeah. Michael, maybe you want to add something because you had a Greek question as well.
I have a Greek question.
You have a Greek question.
I'm Michael Ignatiu.
We'll take the Greek questions together.
Yes, I'm Michael Ignatiu from Mega TV. According to some people, some analysts in Brussels, Greece is going to need a new haircut in its debt in the summer. What is your opinion, Mr. Dallara, since you are the one who negotiated the previous one?
Well, I think, first of all, in response to the first 2 questions, the easiest way I could stir up controversy in Greece today is to comment on the domestic political scene. And I hope you will understand that I'm going to refrain from doing that. I think this is the business of the Greek people and Greek leaders. And I actually, even recognizing the enormous strain that has existed in the Greek society, the Greek economy, the Greek political structure over these last months, I'm quite confident that Greece will continue on the path of economic reform. Why? Because they've invested so much already in it that continued performance is likely to begin to yield dividends sooner rather than later. Certainly, the Greek economy will continue to contract this year. But with new capital coming in through the support of Europe and the IMF, in particular with the recapitalization of the Greek banks, with the benefits of reform, privatization, liberalization, strengthening revenue collection, etc., beginning, I believe, to show evidence in the months ahead. I think optimism and some degree of confidence can return sooner than many expect. Confidence is a very elusive reality, and it has not prevailed around Greece in quite some time now, 2.5 years. But there were periods when confidence was on the rebound, including the late summer and early fall of 2010. And I see no reason why Greece cannot, with some continued discipline in its pursuit of its reform program, begin to rebuild the threads of market confidence, investor confidence, and from there, there is considerable upside. I think we have learned, and I think, I hope European leaders have learned that there are clear needs for improvement in the decision-making process in Europe. Greece, never mind what we as private investors were subjected to in having to negotiate with one sovereign, Greece, and then having to subject those negotiations to 16 other sovereigns and 4 multilateral institutions. Greece had to undergo the same difficulty, and I think for them it was exceptionally challenging, and I think that streamlining and improving the decision-making apparatus within the Eurozone, in my view, has to be an urgent priority for European leadership, because today it is very difficult, and as you know, an individual sovereign can veto or block what is supported by a very large consensus of policymakers. I think this added palpably to the market uncertainties during crucial times of the negotiations over the last 9 months. And I would hope, just as we at a global level take stock of the lessons to be learned from Greece, that European Eurozone leaders in particular would do the same and move forward. There are some ideas already moving forward under consideration regarding moving toward majority decision-making. Other measures need to be considered if the Eurozone is to have a much more efficient decision-making process in place.
You didn't answer my question about the haircut.
It's very trendy, isn't it? And to talk about the need for another haircut. But to me, this is not only a very remote possibility, but it's beside the point. The key to achieving that sustainability in Greece is not further reductions in its debt. It's establishing a steady diet of growth for the economy. Without growth, it's unlikely to, we're unlikely to see any country sustaining its levels of debt, no matter how modest they are. I think the debt reduction is unprecedented and as historic as it is, gives Greece a huge window of opportunity. And I think that there are growing signs that they will seize this window of opportunity, and I think that it's exceptionally misplaced to be concerned at this stage, or at any stage, about the need for further debt restructuring. I think that with implementation of reforms and with renewed confidence, that Greece will be on a path to debt sustainability and growth.
So we're really running out of time. Bundle of questions here. Stella, you had a question, and Patrick, and then Barry, and then I think we're...
I wanted to ask, you said, Mr. Trump, that this is a good first step on the firewalls, and you would like to see something in the realm of 940 billion. So what would the second step be? Could you quantify and explain what you might be looking for on that? And then secondly, I wanted to follow up on some of the remarks Mr. Sutton was making about the credit contraction in emerging markets, which you said on one hand can be seen as quite encouraging that they might avoid some overheating. But given the slowdown in the European economy and indeed unsatisfactory growth pattern in the US and the contraction in exports, which you already talked about, how high do you see the risks of a sharp slowing in the emerging market economies that could spill over globally and create quite a considerable global slowdown?
Do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, thank you. I think that we may use the word first step because those are the kind of things that probably would encounter somewhat less controversy or political opposition in different national parliaments. Because right now Europe has two firewall facilities out there. One is the EFSF with capacity of 440 billion, more than half already committed for the program countries, and the ESM, which will come into being starting July 1st of this year. So it will be, in my view, rather straightforward and less problematic just for the leaders to decide to combine the two facilities, to let them run alongside each other for some period of time, so that altogether they have 940 billion euro firepower, some of which already committed to the 3 program countries. Second step would be to make sure that the conditionality for their use, how they can be mobilized, how they can be used to support countries in need, and how they can be used to intervene in secondary market to support countries, would be made to be more flexible, more timely, and less subject to parliamentary control, the way it is still the case at the moment. And then beyond that, depending on market developments, the key point that I raised earlier is that at the end of the day, we think that the durable, long-term, fundamental solution to the debt crisis in Europe is a mutualization of fiscal resources and fiscal risk and fiscal burdens. That means moving toward more centralized fiscal policy in the euro area to be commensurate with the common currency. If that is the case, then we are moving a big step forward.
I mean, one of the features of this survey, since we've been doing it, this emerging market lending survey, is there's always been very strong demand for credit in the emerging world. So it caught our attention when actually in recent quarters it began to dip, and then this quarter for the first time it began to go down. The reading was below 50. If you look at the detail on pages 13 and 14, I won't go through it, but the region that's most evident is Europe, which is no great shock. So again, you can view this as a bit of a spillover from the European crisis. Demand in some of the other regions is holding up a little better. But I think it is a reminder that, you know, we're living in a complicated world. And, you know, if you're sort of sitting there in many of these emerging economies, you've got a lot of conflicting influences, you know, a lot of global weakness being thrown at you. You've got high oil prices, which is raising, and high food prices, raising headline inflation tensions. And then on the other hand, you know, you're trying to keep your domestic demand going, both to support growth as well as to kind of give the world a support. So it's not, you know, policy setting in Europe and the US is difficult, but in the emerging world it's also quite a challenge. I mean, one country we draw your attention to is Brazil, where, you know, there's clearly mixed issues here. You know, there are some tensions with respect to inflation, but there's also, you know, some problems with respect to growth weakness, a lot of it coming from a high exchange rate and weakness abroad. So in that environment, it is quite a challenge to set policy properly. I think the bottom line I would take away from this is that in this sort of demand for credit environment, you probably should expect emerging market interest rates to continue to drift downwards for a while.
Okay, very, very quickly, let's get both these questions and then we'll have very quick answers. Yes, go, Patrick.
When you talk about mutualization of fiscal burden in Europe, do you mean in the end euro bonds? What do you mean with that? Do you mean some kind of fiscal authority, having common taxes all over Europe?
Okay, well, let's get Barry's question, then we'll
Barry Wood from RTHK. In Europe, the credit squeeze is worsened by the deepening recession in some countries and the fiscal compact. I wondered your views on the fiscal compact.
Well, first on the fiscal compact. The fiscal compact represents, I think, something positive and important. That is a commitment by the Eurozone to greater fiscal discipline going forward. But the fiscal compact alone poses serious short-term risks without a flexible approach toward how and when each country achieves fiscal discipline, and without the necessary supporting structural reforms that are essential for growth enhancement and job creation. And therefore, the concern we have is not about the fiscal compact per se. It is more about the need for a broader, more balanced, more nuanced, more tailored approach to how and when countries achieve fiscal discipline. I cannot help but feel, and I would reiterate, that it's important for countries like Portugal and Spain to be on moderated paths of short-term fiscal adjustment along with reinforced structural reform. if the short-term effects on growth are not to run a high risk of undermining the integrity of the entire economic program. I think that addresses.
And mutualization. Do you want to say
Well,
anything about that?
just two brief words, and then Hong can add a brief word. I think Eurobonds could be one avenue, and frankly, we continue to believe that it merits consideration. But what we are talking about is Hong suggested, is something much more profound. If you go back to the vision that many European leaders have had, including almost 2 decades ago, former Chancellor Kohl, what you are looking at and what is still eventually needed is an integrated set of fiscal policies in Europe, and most likely eventually moving toward a common set of revenue and spending management. That's a bold concept, but it's not necessarily inconsistent with comments that have been made over recent months with, for example, by Minister Schäuble of Germany and many others. But Europe needs to get on with it, in my view.
Well, that's pretty good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.